Speaker, the question of this debate is a simple one. Should governments prioritize marginal improvements to the already well-developed and sophisticated transportation systems that exist within cities and economic hubs, or should they bother to finally spend some time and attention on rural areas that have otherwise been neglected? Finally bother to connect together those economic hubs, which is in fact far more important for overall growth and would be far more beneficial to the country. I'm going to make three arguments. Firstly, explain why we're able to get more transportation infrastructure on our side. Secondly, why that infrastructure is far more valuable on our side. And finally, why we get far more economic growth on our side. Let's start with the question of why we get more infrastructure. And the question here is like, what is the comparison between the kinds of things that we'd be building? We think presumably the kinds of things that side affirmative would defend be building more roads or expanding the capacity of roads within cities, maybe expanding train lines, building more bus routes, ferries, light rail, etc. We'd support things like highways that connect different towns or cities together. We would defend things like long range and high speed rail, etc. So why is it that we're likely to be able to get more transportation infrastructure built? There are three reasons. The first reason is that it's cheaper and easier to build on our side. Firstly, infrastructure utilizes cheap land on our side, because it's in areas where people don't currently live, connecting two cities or towns together, whereas on their side you have to build in already densely populated cities where most of the land is already held or used for some particular purpose, and therefore tends to be quite expensive. Secondly, the government often already owns the land in rural areas because there's no particular use for it. Secondly, you don't need to work around any existing infrastructure, which is often a huge impediment. Like, the reason the metro line in Sydney has to be built underground is because there is no room to build it above ground, and tunneling means that everything becomes 10 times more expensive. Whereas, for example, just setting up high-speed rail on territory where there's nothing around, nothing to get in the way, is far cheaper, far easier, and therefore far more likely to occur. But finally, there are just far more NIMBYs that are likely to block any kind of project that occurs in the city because it might harm the environment, because it might, destroy their view, the construction noise is annoying, they worry it'll bring more people into their area, etc. Whereas in rural areas, no one really lives there, no one really cares, and the benefits of getting access to that transportation are far more likely to outweigh those relatively minor concerns because people are on net poorer, which means we can afford to build more and we can afford to build faster. Secondly, though, it's far more likely that we get private investment in cities anyway, which means that our benefit is far more exclusive, which is to say that there are reasons why private funders will build infrastructure in cities. For example, it's necessary for their business, for there to be high quality roads or bridges to get, for example, goods to ports, etc. But secondly, because the population density means it's very profitable to build, for example, toll roads, private bus services, private train lines, which is why we see those things exist in many cities. Whereas rural areas often require a subsidy because while it often is economically beneficial to build those particular pieces of infrastructure, it's very hard to capture those benefits because they're dispersed across a wide population, which is precisely the kind of thing the governments ought to engage in, and governments exist for, whereas projects that are per se profitable and viable can be left to the free market. So on our side, there'll probably be a lot of investment in cities anyway from the private sector, so we get much of the benefit that side affirmative would seek to capture there. By contrast, only we're able to invest in, for example, rural areas and get that kind of benefit. Secondly then, why is the infrastructure we build more valuable? There are three reasons. Firstly, diminishing marginal returns. There's already a lot of infrastructure in cities. So, for example, expanding a highway from 8 lanes aside to 10 lanes aside does provide some benefit, but it's not clear that that is a meaningful degree in the same way that connecting a town to another town that previously was never connected is. It means in, for example, developing countries, people in rural village finally get access to the market in a much larger town, can sell their goods, can access a hospital, can access services that they otherwise never would, which is like a massive benefit for their lives, while building another highway in Shanghai might be nice for some residents, but obviously just does not have the same kind of returns. Secondly, it's for the problem of induced demand, which is that often just building more roads or bigger roads, in fact, makes congestion worse because it induces more people to start driving. And that means that everyone is worse off for it, which is why cities are increasingly engaging in things like road diets rather than building more, forms of transportation linkages. Whereas that's obviously not an issue in connecting rural hubs that barely have any connections at the moment. But thirdly, it's for reasons of vulnerability, which is to say that the people we benefit are just far less privileged. People in rural areas tend to be much poorer, tend to have worse access to services and amenities than people in cities. So if there has to be a trade-off between helping either of them, we would say you ought to prioritize people in rural areas. Why is that true? One, as the topic itself implies, cities are hubs of economic activity and therefore tend to have large amounts of wealth, whereas rural areas do not. Secondly, politicians tend to live in cities, so tend to be relatively concerned about amenities existing in those particular areas. And even if they don't care about, say, the poor people in cities, just the existence of those amenities often provides spillover effects because it's very hard to exclude people. So if you build a really nice public hospital, anyone can kind of go to that public hospital, even if it wasn't built for them specifically. Whereas, if you live in a rural area, that doesn't really benefit you much. But finally, the broad trends of rural-urban migration kind of point to the fact that people have a revealed preference for moving to cities because they are richer, because they have better amenities, which is proof of the fact that people in rural areas are more disadvantaged and therefore deserve it more. So this explains why the set of benefits we're able to get, even if you assume that we aren't able to build more infrastructure, we at least build infrastructure that is more valuable. So that is the second reason why you should give side negative debate. Finally, then, let's talk about economic growth and why it is that we're able to get more of it. The first thing we'd note is that we discourage urban sprawl, which is bad for a number of reasons. Why are we able to discourage urban sprawl? Because when there are less linkages within the city, it becomes often the marginal construction in transportation links that would occur is just expanding out transport links to the outskirts of the city and encouraging more building there. When you don't do that, you instead encourage densification of areas of the city that are already well connected, e.g., instead of just building more and more houses out into Western Sydney, you encourage people to build high rises in Chatswood or near train lines that have otherwise developed, such as the Metro line, which just means that the same people get to live there, but they get to live closer to existing amenities, increase population density, which makes it easier to provide other services and infrastructure, etc., which is much more efficient and good in the long run. So it's preferable to discourage sprawl. Secondly, it's because it means that we connect different cities together, which is particularly good because trade often flows between cities, but it also expands the labor market. For example, if you build high-speed rail between Sydney and Wollongong, you allow people to live in Wollongong, which is much cheaper, but still commute into Sydney for their jobs, which means that you combine the Sydney and Wollongong labor markets together, which means you get much bigger agglomeration effects, more economies of scale and specialization in the labor market, which is particularly useful. But finally, this is very important for reducing inequality, because we benefit the poorer people in rural areas rather than richer people, which would widen inequality. That's important for two reasons. Firstly, political stability. When people are more equal, you're less likely to have, for example, people rising up in the country or large amounts of political polarization between the city and country. But secondly, equality tends to drive more consumption, means more people have more discretionary income, which tends to be good for the economy in the long run because those people are also able to spend. So at the end of this debate, we're able to get far more economic growth, which means, for example, particularly in the poor context where much of this debate takes place, people are able to experience really important improvements in their material lives. Things like accessing hospitals they otherwise could not, things like being able to sell their goods at a market they otherwise would not, and those benefits will compound over time. But we also just get more infrastructure and better infrastructure, and for all those reasons, incredibly proud to negate.